The 1920s, just like a lot of other time periods in US history, are absolutely full of complexity and contradictions, which we'll do our very best to cover. But it's absolutely critical to understand that this idea of the 20s as the roaring 20s, a time of prosperity and partying and happiness and fun, was one, not necessarily that for everyone. And two, even when it was that for people, it wasn't necessarily that all the time or even across the playing fields of race and gender. Because the reality is that when we use the terms like the roaring 20s to encapsulate an entire decade of history, well, we're really simplifying things that are incredibly complex and stripping away the nuance of things like local context that are incredibly important. Seeing time periods as a whole like this and giving them fun names does more to reinforce dominant power narratives about what time periods should be than necessarily what it actually was. One of the things that created stability, whether one thinks it was good or bad stability is an entirely separate lecture, is the fact that for the entire decade, the executive branch was under the control of Republican presidents. In 1920, President Warren G. Harding was elected under a slogan of a return to normalcy, the idea that Americans needed to move on from the war and the devastation of it and focus on peace and happiness at home. This was a pretty huge departure from his opponent, Eugene Debs, who was literally running his campaign from prison under the platform of labor rights and the ills of government overreach. And so, under Harding's leadership, the nation moved towards a path of consumerism and industry, essentially forgetting the war and its sadness by buying a new and happier memory. Unfortunately, he couldn't buy his way out of scandal, though, which plagued his presidency after the media got word of illegal oil leases happening within the Department of the Interior. In exchange for bribes from an oil company, the Secretary of the Interior, Albert Fall, illegally leased Navy Reserve oil fields to private companies in Wyoming at Teapot Dome, hence the name Teapot Dome scandal. Since the Secretary of the Interior is appointed by the president directly, this looked ridiculously bad for Harding. Although he dies in 1923, so he doesn't really have to worry too much about it in, say, a re-election campaign. The Republicans' next choice of candidate does have to worry about it, though, because Democrats use it against him, despite the fact that it's actually not his fault at all, as the sign of just sort of general Republican mismanagement and corruption. But that doesn't work super well because the economy is doing well, and a good economy can cover any number of other sins. So Silent Cal Coolidge is elected under the sort of continuation of Harding's program with a slogan of "the business of America is business." He spends his presidency emphasizing laissez-faire economic practices rather than being overly nice to businesses, and focuses a whole lot on cutting government spending, to the extent that he even rejects the extension of bonuses for World War I veterans, which will be a huge problem later. But generally, the economy continues to do fine. So in 1928, Americans elect our third Republican candidate, Herbert Hoover. Now, Americans were really pretty big fans of Hoover, who we need to be careful to not confuse with Hoover from the FBI, totally different people. He'd served under several presidents up to this point, but was really most famous for his role in World War I as the manager of food production. So he was the one who came up with all of the ideas for how to make sure that people at home didn't lose out on food in stores, but also made sure that troops overseas got fed, which is actually an incredibly difficult job. He was really a mastermind of bureaucracy, which is incredibly boring, but insanely important for things like government and war. He's also responsible for bringing a whole ton of standardization into our lives during the war, things that we never think of, like the size of screws in construction materials and traffic signs and such. He and others, it was really a team effort, went to other global leaders and essentially argued that we all need to be on the same page with basic things like that, or we'd never be able to be a global society. Which is why now we have more or less standardized parts for a whole host of things across the globe. Now, Hoover was also a huge fan of the idea of rugged individualism, or the idea that when the going gets tough, the tough get going, that people should pull themselves up from their bootstraps when they're in a pickle, which is a super cool philosophy when things are going well, but not when the Great Depression hits and literally everyone is poor, which is what happens. So when the stock market crashes in 1929 and people look to him for leadership, he essentially stays with this line of thinking and tells people to suck it up and just work hard, which is like not working for them. It's impossible to just work your way out of poverty when there are literally no jobs available. And since he's absolutely unwilling to budge from this line of thinking, the Great Depression is what really ends our line of Republican dominated executive leadership. But for now, it's almost like the Republican roaring 20s, at least in the executive branch. In the period from roughly the tail end of World War I to the start of the Great Depression, the United States is sitting in a pretty good spot economically. So this is one of the things that goes into feeding into the dominant narrative of the 20s as a period of booming prosperity. There are several reasons for this. One of the reasons has to do with the recent global conflict itself. As you can see from our map here, a ton of European nations owed money to the United States in the wake of World War I, especially due to loans that we'd given to our allies during the war. And since we were essentially untouched in terms of our own physical damage during the war, it's not like we had to spend our own money to fix damages to infrastructure or anything. So financially speaking, we were taking in money, or at least in a position to be taking back money, from European friends, which also puts us in a bit of an advantage from terms of trade deals and other international diplomacy. The 20s also sees the widespread use of a system of scientific management, which is also called Taylorism after its creator, Frederick W. Taylor. So Taylor writes this book called The Principles of Scientific Management, in which he says that the best and most efficient way to run a business is to have all of the parts of your system broken into easy to manage segments that pretty much literally anyone can do. Doesn't matter if they're super educated or even really speak a ton of English. You can essentially point to a button and tell someone that their job is to push that button 30 times a minute as a piece of fabric appears in front of them. You then train the next guy to do a slightly different job, and so on and so forth. These guys get paid next to nothing since they don't really have much to do or know much. Then you can hire some middle management. These guys essentially make sure that all the lower level people are doing the things when and how they're supposed to do. Now, this job isn't necessarily mind-bending either, but they do have some sense of responsibility, and perhaps you want them to write up reports for you every once in a while, so they need to be able to read and write maybe, so you pay them a little bit more than the lower level workers. And then at the top are essentially the owners of the company, you presumably, who keep all the rest of the money. This system is meant to make literally any task possible by any group of people. So a super complicated piece of work, say a chair that at one time used to be made by a skilled carpenter or craftsman, once broken into 10 smaller tasks, can be made for less money and potentially in less time. And Taylor really didn't care that he was taking all of the luxury and uniqueness out of craftsmanship. He didn't really see any charm in holding on to old and outdated skills-based trades like master carpentry. If there was a more efficient way to do a job, that was the way he thought that it should be done. Industrialists like Henry Ford applied the style of management to their own innovations in the workplace, the assembly line in his case, to make their factories more efficient for themselves. So when we talk about the 1920s in general as a time of economic boom, these things generally are major contributing factors to that. But they're not the only factors. In addition to things like scientific management, other contributing factors included things like the increased use of oil and electricity in factories. This meant that industries could continue production 24/7 without interruption, working on new shift schedules to keep things at that pace, or at least 24/6 with Sundays off for church. Government policies favoring businesses also contributed to this, which isn't like a new concept. We've seen this before during the market revolution. During the 20s, the federal government created tax cuts for businesses, decreased prosecution of antitrust violations, and low interest loans so businesses could expand. Taken together, this government favor tended to lead to business growth at a rapid speed, some at an unhealthy speed, and speculation on the stock market, which will of course be a problem for later. But for now, the general effect is that the economy is doing relatively well, and most Americans are generally making more money than they were before the First World War. That's not to say that there isn't income inequality, though. That totally still exists. What tends to happen is that everyone just takes a little bit of a step up. So if white men made the most money, and then from there it went in sort of successive steps downward to white women and communities of color or immigrants, themselves broken down even further by gender disparity, when the economy does better, everyone essentially takes a step forward. It's not that everyone is suddenly all making the same amount. There's still a wide gap between those groups. They've just changed the marker of where the gaps are on the scale of money. So the question then becomes, what are people spending their money on? And the answer is literally everything. The production boom leads to a consumer economy boom, partially due to a boost in actual money making, and also due to a whole lot of people's ability to buy on credit, or what also becomes referred to as buying on margin. So you'd go to a store and there would be an item you'd want, like a fancy new couch, for example, and it costs $1,000. And you only have like $300, but you've got a steady job. That's okay. The store owner says that they'll open you an account and you can give them your $300 now, and then you'll make monthly payments on the couch until you've paid it off. Today, instead of doing this at each store we buy things at, we do this with credit cards. So you buy things with the credit card and pay on that debt each month. The credit card company is responsible for checking out your background when you apply for the card to see how much money they should give you as a maximum each month, which is dependent on how much money you currently have and if you have things like a steady job and how long you've been employed, or things like if you have a history of being able to pay off similar debts consistently or not. And with the increased use of things like electricity everywhere at this point, there are all kinds of new technologies and appliances that people are buying or updating in their lives. And the way companies get you to buy their product is through advertising, which is, of course, not new by any means, but advertising firms in the 1920s, which are actually new, come up with all kinds of new ways to sell things to people. So they start to use new forms of color in ads, and they start running ads like the ones for Lucky Strike cigarettes on the top left, there that have your favorite sports icons on them. Which cigarette companies were really the kings of advertising for quite a while because they spent decades advertising products that they totally knew caused cancer. And then, well after they knew that, they continued spending money on them using tactics to advertise them in literally every way that they could think of to dodge that question and subject. Other advertisers, like Dr. Pepper just below that, relied more on slogans and catchphrases, like theirs was at 10, 2, and 4 o'clock. So the idea is that you should be drinking a Dr. Pepper at those times of the day. I'm not sure who would really want a Dr. Pepper at 10 a.m., perhaps some people in Texas, though, honestly, but that's the thinking at least. In a lot of advertising, race and more specifically racial stereotypes were used as marketing ploys. The ad on the left is obviously from Canada, but had very similar renditions on the same theme in the United States. So here we have a Native American man in a sort of stereotypical scene for that trope, especially considering pretty much none of the native tribes in Canada lived in teepees. And there's not even a half-hearted reason for this. The poster isn't aimed at the First Peoples of Canada. It's not trying to get them to donate to the cause. It's literally just using the trope for the sake of using it. The same can be seen in the United States on coffee brands, tea brands, sports teams, and butter like Land O'Lakes. The group probably most stereotyped in advertising were African Americans. In both the center and right advertisements, African Americans were used as racialized props for contrasting to whiteness. In the ad for white veneer, a form of paint, the young man's over-accentuated black skin is used as a contrast to the white paint. And in the ad for the bleaching soda, the two black children in the boat remark that they're going to use the product to bleach their skin like their formerly black third friend in the boat, which is not only contrasting their skin with his, but carries the obvious tone and message that black skin is something to be undesired, and that one should seek out a means of lightening and bleaching, ideas that led to massive discussion and division within the black community. One of the biggest ticket items that people bought were cars. Ford started making the Model T in 1908, and between that time and when the car went out of commission, the company sold around 15 million of the model. By 1929, there was nearly one car per family in the United States. As you can see from the chart and the advertisement on the right, the price of the car went down pretty dramatically as more people bought them and as factories got more efficient at producing them. The only exception to that happened during World War I. Ford's key to success was his competitive business model. He used Taylor's idea of scientific management and then applied his own system of the automated assembly line to that. Each worker had a part to play in the assembly line, and then as they finished that, a new car, or part of the car, would appear in front of them and they'd do their part on that car. Ford also only hired the very best workers, which he was able to do by paying them astronomically more than anyone around, $5 per day. Under this logic, the workers would be able to actually afford the very cars they were making, which is actually pretty genius if you think about it, because if someone can afford the product they're making, they're going to go the extra mile to actually do a quality job of making it. After all, what if they buy that one? They want to know that it's a quality product. They want to be proud to be driving one. But Ford also wanted to make sure that the people he was paying all this money to weren't just spending it on random crap like alcohol or squandering it on dumb things and living a lifestyle that would make him look bad. So he'd pop into their homes, usually unannounced, to check on them. He'd talk to their wife and kids, look into their bank records, and do other checks on them. And if he found that your lifestyle was unsatisfactory to him, you'd be fired. Only the best for the Ford factory. But Ford's influence also had some extremely harmful impacts as well. Henry Ford was extremely anti Semitic, meaning he was extremely hateful towards the Jewish community. This wasn't particularly different from a whole lot of white men during this time period, since a ton of them blamed Jewish people for World War I for some reason. But Henry Ford took this hatred to whole new levels. He bought a local newspaper called the Dearborn Independent and used it as a vehicle, no pun intended, to spread his message about how the Jews were ruining America and were trying to take over the world. And if this were just something that he did with his spare time or stayed within a group of like-minded people, it probably wouldn't have been such a huge deal. But Ford had stacks of the Dearborn Independent delivered to his factories all over the United States for his workers to read and take home. And when a Ford car came off the assembly line, there was a copy of the newspaper sitting in the front seat for new owners to take home and read. I don't want to overemphasize the impact Henry Ford had, because he was, after all, just one person. But he was an incredibly wealthy and powerful person. Wealthy and powerful enough for Hitler to take notice and respect him. Wealthy and powerful enough for the Nazis to give him an award in 1938 for his innovative genius. And it's worth noting that Hitler and the Nazi government were aware of him and his many writings during World War II. And they were aware of other powerful and wealthy men who were like-minded. The other group who were aware of this cluster of powerful anti-Semitic people were American Jews. And so when it comes to the United States' response to the Holocaust and other atrocities against the Jewish people during that war, those responses were most definitely colored by men like Henry Ford, both because we know that men like that have considerable power in the government, and because when oppressed groups see that powerful people like that are so very vocal about their hatred, they're not going to necessarily go out on a limb to take abuse and speak out against it. But in any case, the workers that he hired cranked out millions of cars over the course of the 1920s, and this led to widespread changes in the United States. It gave people a greater sense of independence, especially younger people and women. It also led to workers being able to more reliably live further away from where they worked. People didn't necessarily have to live in crowded cities anymore because they didn't have to walk or could rely on streetcars to get to the factory or office anymore. And it led to new ways of thinking about space and accepting that with the speeding up of life, perhaps standardization might be in order. But while all of this is happening in the cities, let's not forget our friends, the farmers, the ones who feed pretty much everyone, because they're having a less awesome time in the 1920s due to a little bug called the boll weevil. So this insect, which is really a form of the beetle, migrated up from Mexico and Central America during the late part of the 19th century and into Texas, where it then spread all across the rest of the South, as you can see from our map here. But the early 1920s, it had hit the rest of the coast and down into Florida. And the boll weevil is particularly terrible because it really, really loves to feed on cotton pollen, which if you have been sleeping under a rock for a while, like cotton is literally pretty much all we're growing in the South. Boll weevils actually kill cotton plants by laying eggs in the cotton flower pod, which then ruins it before it can bloom into actual cotton. So while everyone in more urban areas is singing the praises of industrial economists, farmers are really suffering because they're having to fight this insect that comes through the South like some kind of biblical plague. Even worse, the boll weevil was extremely flexible in terms of adapting to the things that farmers were using to try to kill it. They tried things like arsenic, DDT, which is a pesticide we'll actually talk about again later, and a whole host of other deadly chemicals. And in addition to being really awful for the environment, these chemicals were particularly terrible for the people out working in the fields picking cotton, like the cotton that managed to actually grow. Because when it did grow, the cotton had these chemicals on it. And so the people picking it had these chemicals all over their skin all the time. And the vast majority of these agricultural workers were one, poor, two, minorities, and or three, children. Often they were all three. So imagine a little kid with no shoes out in a field all day picking arsenic coated cotton. That's the 1920s South. This was also especially hard on specific minority groups like Mexican laborers, who, if you remember, were recruited to come do agricultural labor during World War I. These people have now come and established a life and had children who are definitely American citizens, and they're out working in these fields with this poison too. And as things get economically really rough due to the boll weevil infestation, they'll see some of the worst discrimination as a result. But not everything in the 1920s, or at least the popular version of it that dominant culture likes to paint, was about economics. A lot of it had to do with entertainment and celebration, or as Warren G. Harding called it, a return to normalcy. One of the many ways Americans learned to take their minds off of things was by turning to sports. This isn't like a new concept. And in the 1920s, the three biggest sports were boxing, football, and baseball. Jack Johnson was a boxer whose career was actually at its height a decade before the 1920s. In 1910, he battled Jim Jeffries for the world heavyweight title, in which the media called the fight of the century. After winning the title and over $100,000 cash, white Americans started going after Johnson in a way they hadn't even when he had been successful before. But Johnson wasn't going to allow racism to stand in the way of enjoying the lifestyle that he'd rightfully earned. Both before and after his world title, he spent his cash prizes without hesitation on things he wanted, and didn't feel compelled to stick to traditional Jim Crow standards that said that he should only date and marry black women. All three of the women he eventually married were white women. In 1912, he was convicted of violating the Mann Act for traveling with his white girlfriend across state lines before they were married. Under the premise of protecting white women from being sold into prostitution, the Mann Act was really a way of policing consensual relationships between interracial couples. Johnson went into exile in Europe, but came back to the United States in 1920 to serve out his sentence. He continued boxing afterwards until he was in his 50s. In the world of football, one of the most accomplished players in the game was Jim Thorpe. In addition to football, he was also excellent at baseball, lacrosse, boxing, hockey, and won gold medals in the 1912 Olympics for the decathlon. Before joining the world of professional sports, he played football at Carlisle Indian School because he's of Sauk and Fox descent. There, he played for legendary coach Pop Warner, who pioneered a whole host of offensive gaming techniques. And then in baseball, there's obviously Babe Ruth, who played for the Red Sox and then the Yankees for a total of 22 career seasons. He hit over 700 home runs in his career, which stood as the record until the mid-1970s. But sports have always been more than just about their entertainment aspect, as is the case with literally any aspect of the entertainment industry. In the early 20th century, American sports had as much to do with civil rights, capitalism, and imperialism as the actual game itself. Baseball, for example, came to the United States in the 1840s via immigration from England as a distortion of other bat and ball games. It spread through the country during the Civil War period and eventually took the form we're more familiar with today in professional leagues by the 1870s. By that time, American school teachers doing English lessons in Japan brought the sport there, where it seriously took off. American imperialism throughout that period also spread the sport via military invasion to places like Cuba, Puerto Rico, and countries in South America like Venezuela. By 1912, baseball was a featured Olympic spectacle. And like all other sports in the Olympics, this meant that it was an opportunity to show off the idea of American exceptionalism and the athletic prowess of American men. Failure wasn't just an embarrassment for individuals, but at the global level, it meant failure as a nation, a patriotic and political spectacle. This was the same in the 1930s when African American boxer Joe Louis faced off against German boxer Max Schmeling. Under very blatant racist assumptions of Nazi white superiority, the fight was not only a battle between the US and Germany, but a fight to prove the very foundations of racial equality. So the sports popular in the 20s aren't just there for people's entertainment. They were part of a larger framework of national politics. As we saw just minutes ago, they were also part of the national economy as advertisers, a concept we're extremely familiar with today. In the sense that we have influencers today in mass media, sports stars of the 20s were the influencers of their day. Another entertainment obsession of the 20s was flight. We know that the Wright brothers laid claim to the first public test of a biplane in North Carolina in 1908, although they're certainly not the only ones working on the design. And the plane becomes a critical piece of machinery in World War I. In the 1920s, pilots and planes become something of a fascination with common Americans. So when Charles Lindbergh does the first transatlantic flight by himself in 1927, it's a pretty big deal. He becomes an instant celebrity. With that, though, comes a whole lot of tragedy. In 1932, his son was kidnapped from their home, which led to a whole massive manhunt, and really the first use of the FBI in their capacity as having jurisdiction over kidnappings across state borders. And after a whole drama with a ransom note and money drop and such, the baby, who was really more of a toddler, was actually dead the entire time. A stranger found his body by accident less than 5 miles from the Lindbergh house, and it was clear that he had been there probably since the night of the kidnapping and died from a blow to the head, potentially from being dropped as the kidnapper tried to take him from the second-story window of the house. The loss of their son devastated the Lindberghs and led to the ruin of their marriage. Charles Lindbergh retained his celebrity status, though, and used it to his advantage less than a decade later to rise to prominence as the spokesperson for the Isolationist American First Committee at the start of World War II. The flight craze of the 20s also inspired the career of Amelia Earhart. In addition to her success as the first woman to achieve the transatlantic solo flight, Earhart set out on the first flight to circumnavigate the globe by plane in 1937 with her co-pilot Fred Noonan. On the map here, you can see this trip listed as number 7. She started in Oakland, California, and made her way east across the U.S. before making stops on several continents. On the final major leg of the trip, she left New Guinea for a fueling station on Howard Island, but never arrived. Her plane was lost. For years, researchers were quite uncertain what happened to Earhart and Noonan's plane, but in 2018, researchers found bones on an island in the Pacific that closely matched Earhart's description. DNA analysis still has to confirm their legitimacy, and it's worth pointing out that there are a number of scholars who are doubtful that they will come back as a match. But Earhart's legacy as a pilot is so much more than just our ability to find her, or even the fact that she didn't quite make it all the way around the globe as she intended to do. In a world where women were reaching beyond their normal boundaries and pushing the limits of what was acceptable for their sex, she did this to the extreme. She didn't just travel outside of her social circle or her neighborhood. She left the country and the continent to travel the world with a man she was not married to for months at a time. She experienced new cultures and new places and wasn't necessarily afraid of their differences. This is what drew people to her story and ultimately what made it so tragic. The way people kept up with these stories was through the radio. Before social media and before TV, people listened to the radio for news and entertainment. And really, unlike radio today, there were only a handful of stations you could tune into for each genre of thing. You had a series of local radio stations, but then there were like 2 really dominant national broadcasting stations, NBC and CBS. And these were incredibly important because in addition to bringing things like the news, they actually worked to bring about a tighter national identity and national unity. Because before this, people really thought about themselves more regionally. People from the Midwest saw themselves one way, and people from the Northeast saw themselves as one way, and people from Texas saw themselves as one way because honestly, we've just always been the way we are. But what national broadcasting did was bring national headlines into people's homes every day. So you would hear stories about moms in trouble in California, and you'd identify strongly with that because they're struggling with the same things that you're struggling with. Or you'd listen to a program about farming prices that explain how they impact industrial production. And suddenly you understand that maybe you should be paying attention to the problems of farmers, even though you've never really considered their problems because you're a factory worker. And so slowly people start to realize a sense of national unity. This also goes across sports fandoms. Suddenly you don't have to like your local sports team just because they're your local sports team, because you can listen to all kinds of teams play on the radio. So if your team sucks, you have plenty of other teams to root for. By the dawn of the Great Depression, about a third of families in America had radios in their homes, which will actually be really important for the government's ability to get news out to people and create an effective strategy of assistance. So, when we think of the Roaring Twenties, it's obviously not incorrect to think of this as one of fun and prosperity, because that's certainly happening. A lot of the things that we take for granted as popular culture today had their origins in the 20s, or at least became more widespread during that period. But we also have to see the 20s for what they are, which is a time of extreme complexity. In our next lesson, we'll dive into exactly what this looks like.